Section 10.1a is going to be an introduction to quadratic functions, and we're going to start by learning to graph quadratic functions. Let's first compare these two equations. This one over here should look familiar to you. It's a standard form of a linear equation. It's what we learned about in chapter 5. This one over here, though, is a standard form of what we call a quadratic equation. This is also known as a quadratic function. I want to compare these two equations and notice the differences here. A linear equation, if you remember, has no exponents, while a quadratic equation has a squared exponent. Also, back in chapter 5, we learned that a linear equation has a graph that's a straight line, something maybe like that. Whereas a quadratic equation creates a new shape that you may not be able to recognize right now. Looks like this. It's either a U that's upside down or it looks like a U. And this is called a parabola. So when you graph quadratic equations, you graph this thing called a parabola. So chapter 10 is all about this new kind of quadratic equation. It's going to graph these symbols called parabolas. And we're going to learn how to look at these equations and to graph them and learn everything about quadratics. As we first start to examine quadratic equations, one of the things we want to do is graph them by using a table of values. So I'm going to create a table of values here for this quadratic, x values and y value combinations that I'm going to plug in. And one thing I'd like you to do is start at the number -3, and I want you to go up by ones until you see a pattern. Now let's see what we're talking about here. Let's start with -3. When I plug a -3 in for x, I'm going to get -3 squared, which is 9, minus a negative is a +3, minus 2, so that's 12 minus 2, which is 10. So -3 gives me a 10. And I'm going to keep doing this with all these x values. Plug in a -2. -2 squared is 4. Minus a negative is a plus. So that's 8 minus 2, which is 6. Keep going with the -1. Minus, plug in a -1. -1 squared is 1. Minus a negative is a plus. So this is going to be a 0. Then we'll plug in 0. I'll go over here and do that. 0 squared minus 0 minus 2. That's a -2. Then we'll plug in a 1. 1 squared is 1. 1 minus 1 minus 2. 1 minus 1 is 0. Minus 2 is -2. Now it's here I want you to stop. Because when you graph parabolas and you plug in points, you're eventually going to notice a pattern. And here I want you to see that this -2 and this -2 are the same number. That means that the number that came just before this -2 is also going to be repeated on the other side of this -2. So you know for sure that this 0 value will also appear on the other side of -2. That's the pattern that I was telling you is going to show up, which means 3 is going to have a value of 6. And so you can see that those ordered pairs match up. So now it's those 6 ordered pairs that we're going to go over here and we're going to graph those. -2, 6 is up here, just off the graph. -1, 0. 0, -2 is down here, and then 1, -2 is there, 2, 0, and 3, 6. And so you should be able to see a parabola taking shape. We're going to connect these dots and try to graph this. Comes just below here, dips back up, because that's what a parabola does, and goes through those points. So that's a sketch of this parabola that's created by this equation over here. The way you do it is you plug in some x values and you begin to look for a pattern. Once you find that pattern, you then can graph your parabola. Here's another parabola that we're going to graph. We're going to use a table of values to do that. And I'm going to choose the same x and y values, or excuse me, the same x values that I did before. I think they're a good place to start. Now for time's sake, I'm going to do all the work here. and then just put the answers up on the screen. So you'll want to pause the video now, try to plug in these x values and look for a pattern, and then come back and play the video and see how you did. So here's the work for all of my ordered pairs, and I notice the pattern begins here at the 4s. This 5 point doesn't have a pair with it, and that's okay. That just means that's the bottom, or in this case the top of my parabola. So I'm going to start there with the 1, 5, and then I have a 0, 4, which is there, and a 2, 4. And then if I go further out, I get a negative 1, 1, and a positive 3, 1. And so this time my parabola is a downward facing parabola. It looks like that. Now I'd like to look back at the two parabolas that we've graphed, and I want to show you a couple things about them. Look at this first one here. This was the equation x squared minus x minus 2, and the parabola opened up. This was our second equation, negative x squared plus 2x plus 4, and in this case the parabola opened down. That's not a coincidence. Whenever you have the very first number in front of the squared term that's negative, your parabola is going to open down. And whenever you have the very first number in front of the x squared that's positive, your parabola is going to open up. So a couple definitions. We say that a maximum is the highest point in a parabola, and an example of that would be this one. This parabola right here has a maximum point. It's the highest point that that parabola will go. It never goes higher, but it does go lower forever. And then a minimum is the lowest point on a parabola, and that's an example in this one. This parabola has a minimum point right there. It never goes lower than that. It goes up forever. Now both of those points, whether they're a maximum or a minimum, have a name. They're called the vertex of the parabola. And the vertex is the place where the parabola starts. Everything either goes above the vertex or below the vertex.